What's going on, guys? One of the last things we need to do to top off the manual swap is to get rid of two of our lights. Now, the check engine light we're not going to be able to fix just by pulling out the gauge cluster, but the transmission light we will. The cars equipped with manual transmissions do not have a bulb in that transmission light spot. So basically we got to do the same thing. All we're going to do is pop out the gauge cluster, pop out the bulb, put the cluster back in, and that'll be it. The transmission light will be done. As far as the check engine light goes, I will have a separate video in the future on that. For now, we're just going to pull the transmission light out. Tools we will be using: 3/8 driver, 13mm socket. That is to get the negative battery terminal off. I do like to disconnect the battery before I start working on the gauge cluster. Needle nose pliers. We're going to be using that to pull the bulb. So the transmission light bulb, we're going to be pulling that out with. It's a little bit easier with some needle nose pliers. A flathead screwdriver. You don't necessarily need this, so I use that to help get some of the connectors out of their little holes. There's a little pin you need to push down, and then you need to slide a little plastic clip forward, and I use that to assist with that. A credit card or something like that is going to make it a little bit easier to help assist getting the gauge out of the dash. I basically use that to slide it between the dash and the actual gauge cluster to help sort of pull it forward. A T15 bit. So the two screws that hold the gauge cluster on are T15. They're not flathead or Phillips. This has like a little screwdriver that sort of goes on that end, but because we're in a little bit of a tight space, I can't really get a screwdriver in there. So I used a 1/4" socket and a 1/4" driver. Now you could do the same exact trick with a 3/8. We're basically going to throw that little 1/4" on like that, and then throw our T15 bit on top of that. That's basically how that looks to get that guy off. Makes it a little bit easier. It's going to be kind of hard to get a screwdriver in there. If you have just a T15 3/8 or a 1/4" bit that goes on a ratchet, that'll work perfectly fine. So a lot of threads and a lot of forums say a lot of different things. So with removing the gauge cluster, for one, you do not have to pull the steering wheel out of the way. If you have a quick release steering wheel, it makes it a little bit easier to get the gauge cluster out, but you don't have to have a quick release to get the gauge cluster out. They come out perfectly fine with the factory steering wheel. If you want to get a quick release steering wheel as an excuse to pull your gauge cluster out easier, I am more for that. The first thing we're going to have to do is disconnect the batteries. So I've heard of a lot of people pull these out with the battery still connected. I like to disconnect my battery just to prevent any issues. There are a lot of rumors that the SRS airbag light will come on if you pull it with the battery in. You know, just to avoid all of that mess, I like to disconnect mine first. And that is a simple 13. We'll wrap him. So there are two T15 screws, one here and one right here, and that's basically all that holds the gauge cluster in. So we're going to get those guys out, and we'll pull the other one out. Now we basically have to feed this guy out. And to help me with that, so I have my K1 membership card. Anything like this, a rewards card or a credit card, anything like that's going to make it pretty easy, basically. So we're going to slide it on top and sort of wiggle it out at the same time. See that? So I'm pushing down on the bottom of it and sort of using the card to wiggle the top free. And we can wiggle that guy up and sort of out. Now we're going to want to try and rotate him to the side like that so that we can get at our electrical connections in the back. So now we do have a couple connections back here, and they all sort of operate the same way. So if you'll notice, there's this little black part right here, and then on top we have like this little tab. So we're going to push down on the tab and slide that black part up. You see that? And it's going to come up with it. So we're just going to take that all the way out. That connector is going to come off, move him out of the way, and then we'll do the same to the other one back there. And I'm going to use a flathead to sort of help me out with this one because it's a little bit of a tight spot. Push down and up, and that connector is free to come out. There we go. And then there's one more just like that. He's just on the way back over there. Now, as far as maneuvering goes, I find it's a little bit easier to go through the steering wheel, and then we can get our last connector off there. And if you can sort of get this edge over the dash like that, and put the key in one click and sort of work it and turn the wheel at the same time, and then the gauge cluster will come out. Alright, now we're going to be very careful with the back of this because it is a circuit board. Now, for the transmission light, this is our bulb right here, so it is the 8th from the right side. So that is the transmission light bulb. Another good way to try and figure out which one that is to take a flashlight on your phone and stick it through an empty hole and then shine it through. So you see that one's lit up. Now if you sort of go over them, you can get a glimpse of what light is behind it. There's the gear light. I don't know if you guys can see that one lit up. So just a good way to find the one you're looking for. So we are going to take this guy and we're going to twist him with some needle nose, pull him out, and then that'll be it. From here we basically reinstall the cluster and that light will be out. Now the reinstall is basically going to be the same. I'm going to turn the wheel to the right a little bit, sort of get my gauge cluster started, and sort of work it and turn it in. Then we can sort of maneuver him. Now to get these guys on, I'm going to sort of leave it up like that a little bit. And as we put them on, we're going to want to make sure that tab is down, and as we push them in, that tab will slide back up. And this part's a little bit tricky, but you really have to feel around for it. There we go. So that white one is in, and I'm going to sort of jimmy it into place and move it a little bit to the right side there, and then go for the back ones. And same deal, I'm going to want to make sure that that tab is straight down, and when I push him in, then we're going to move him back. And it's a little bit tricky, but if you can feel where he's supposed to clip in, it's going to make it a little bit easier to find it. There we go. That one probably took me close to 5 minutes, I won't lie. And then our last little guy here. There we go. Now we got him all in place. And sort of wiggle and push him back into his spot. And then he can slide back into his home. There we go. We can throw our screws back in. Tighten those guys down. And all they do is hold the gauge cluster in place. So don't freaking kill these screws, otherwise you might do some damage. And last thing is reconnect our battery. There we go. Alright, there we go. Our gauge cluster is back in. Now if we start it, no more transmission light. Thank you guys so much for watching. Keep it fresh, and I will see you guys later.